Welcome to Northeast Wind's Virtual Black History Commemoration Tour. We hope that you will learn something new that you never knew existed right in your own backyard. We're proud to be part of the greatest city in the world, New York, and to honor the profound legacy of our indomitable ancestors. These were Africans captured and stolen from the continent of our motherland. This industry, started by the Dutch under the Dutch West India Company in the 1600s, used its human cargo to build the colony of New Amsterdam under harsh and inhuman conditions. However, these hardships would be nothing compared to their successors, the British Royal African Company, who used the colony to build slavery instead of the other way around. The scenes you're about to see are from Lower Manhattan, familiar grounds to most of us. The southernmost tip of the then New Amsterdam, in the beginning, a struggling Dutch colony. Early census record shows only 500 inhabitants. This area specifically was desolate, hilly swampland with a ravine. It stretched from Chinatown to Broadway and beyond as far as 14th Street. Part of this entire area was the final resting place for enslaved Africans who lived and toiled in the colony after it was no longer permissible for them to be buried in the cemetery at Holy Trinity because white folks were buried there. This cemetery was closed in 1794, and the descendants of those buried here later lived in the area. This tour will unearth significant locations within the vicinity, and we will show their value in shaping the emancipation of a generation. Again, we hope you will learn something new you never knew existed right in your own backyard.
Then located on 31st Center Street between Worth and Leonard, the St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church was and is a continuing epicenter for Black worship, mutual aid, and activism from its early formation. Between Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem, the church originated from meetings had by a group of African Americans who had been worshiping at the Trinity Church on Wall Street. They withdrew from said church in 1809 and formed the Free African Church of St. Philip under the leadership of Peter Williams Jr., a graduate of the African Free School. Nearly a decade after that, in 1818, they formed the St. Philip's Episcopal Church on Center Street in Lower Manhattan. The building would later find its home in 1910 on 134th Street in Harlem. Many of the servants of this church had seen themselves move upwardly within the abolitionist movements and other Reformation groups within the community. Another source for community building was the New York African Society for Mutual Relief. Insurance companies denied service and policies to Black individuals seeking resources, and lasting till 1860, the society was created by abolitionists who created ways to successfully gather resources of neighborhood wealth, used to help widows, to serve as a brokerage house for African Americans to buy real estate and pay for burial expenses for members of the community. The New York African Society for Mutual Relief was a pivotal and the most successful attempt for Black New York artists, craft makers, and real estate agents to buy real estate for investment needs. As soon as it was legal for African American New Yorkers to organize, they did. Founding members of the society included bootmakers, real estate dealers, carpenters, innkeepers, editors, mechanics, railroad operators, and other trade and high-profile individuals, many of whom were able to establish long-lasting careers and created neighborhood resources and spots to build wealth, such as restaurants. Cato's was one of said restaurants, fun fact, opened by Cato Alexander, once a slave from South Carolina, who by the 1820s established Cato's, catering to wealthy and powerful families and redistributing said wealth. Notable member of the society, Juliet Toussaint, wife of Pierre Toussaint, a popular hairdresser in antebellum New York, secured property which became one of the stops on the Underground Railroad, located in the heart of the 5 Points intersection of Manhattan, 42 Orange Street, today Baxter Street, obviously used by runaway slaves as a place to stay safe on their journey to freedom. With the decline of the 5 Points area, so did the decline of the society. By 1843, anti-abolition riots and violence prompted New York African Society for Mutual Relief leaders to abandon the building. The society moved to Greenwich Street and then to West 66th Street. This, however, did not diminish the impact New York African Society for Mutual Relief had, as in 1860 the society had assets of $15,000, a remarkable feat considering their wealth and financial success was because of real estate investment, something African Americans were shut out of. By the end of World War II, the society closed its doors as members began to find other societal outlets for social and economic activity and support. Thus, the society created a lasting impact in the community in the example they provided on the strength in community. The 1809 one-year anniversary address to the society by William Hamilton, founding member and believed to be the son of Alexander Hamilton, fun fact, can be found online, in which he ends his address with, "Let us all be united, my brethren, in rearing this edifice. Steady to our several departments, and so on shall be raised a wide-spreading dome that shall stand the admiration and praise of succeeding generations, and on its front shall be eternally mutual interest, mutual benefit, and mutual relief."
Foley Square sits on top of Collect Pond, a body of fresh water that served as reservoir and various other purposes from the time of the colonizers to around the end of the Revolutionary Wars. It is said that the future King George IV once ice skated there. This 30-acre lake was drained into the Hudson River, the then North River, and covered with as much as 25 feet of fill in 1803 to make way for residential housing. Today, we see impressive architecture, government buildings, and numerous courts. The one thing that stands out the most, though, is the iconic Triumph of the Human Spirit monument dedicated to the unnamed enslaved Africans stolen from Africa who worked under harsh conditions and died young from various diseases, including malnutrition and lead poisoning from the water supply in the colony of New Amsterdam. The remains of 427 Africans were unearthed from their resting place in 1991 when the city began excavation for the construction of government office buildings. These remains tell us a lot of how these ancestors were treated and the hardships they suffered building the colony of New Amsterdam. You can learn more about this at the African Burial Ground located nearby at 290 Broadway. The tombs. A notorious prison modeled after an Egyptian tomb was also built here. As the story goes, its foundations cracked and ultimately settled in the pond and was collapsing. So the city builds a second tomb, which begins to sink again. Not until 1890 that the city realizes that there may be some supernatural protesting involved and gives up construction. They create a park instead. Frederick Douglass, the most eloquent ex-slave turned abolitionist who ever lived, escapes Maryland using the identity papers of a sailor. He spent his first night in the city under a barrel in an alleyway of the tombs. Sailors then were known as agents of freedom and smugglers of abolitionist newspaper and news. While in New York City, Frederick knew he had to be careful who he trusted, as there were slave hunters desperate for a bounty everywhere. David Ruggles, a former sailor himself who was born free in Connecticut, assisted him to make his way safely out of the city to upstate New York, where we know of his work. You can learn more about the life and times of these ancestors and others on a Northeast Winds historic trip to Rochester, New York.
Any fugitive slave in search of free state would have probably come across David Ruggles' house in the Northeast. Northeast winds, point intended. Who is David Ruggles, and why was his house considered one of the epicenters of the Underground Railroad movement in New York? David Ruggles was born in Connecticut to free blacks and migrated to New York in 1826 at the age of 16. Where his legacy in the abolitionist movement would flourish and take off for being responsible for the freeing of more than 600 fugitive slaves. Ruggles made an honest living as a grocery store owner and is credited for being the first African American to own a bookstore, publishing the first journal written and edited by a black man. During his time in New York, he became deeply involved in the anti-slave movement, which led to his contributions to the abolitionist newspaper and an open-door policy at his residency that would aid in helping enslaved blacks take their freedom back. It would not be a surprise that Frederick Douglass and David would have crossed paths on his own personal journey to freedom. It was in 1833 when David assisted Douglass in gaining his freedom and reuniting him with his fiancée, Anna Murray. David's boardhouse would not only serve as a prominent station on the Underground Railroad, but symbolic of equality and normalcy that blacks wanted to experience alongside their white counterparts. Douglass and Anna Murray would get married at the Ruggles boardhouse, which became a testimony to all the house represented during the abolitionist movement. A friendship developed between Ruggles and Douglass. Because of Ruggles' compassion and integrity, men like Douglass were successful in gaining their freedom. 36 Lisbon Street was the home of David Ruggles and the heartbeat of the Underground Railroad right here in New York City over 200 years ago. David is credited with being a mentor to Douglass on his journey to obtaining freedom, which gained Douglass a lot of press. The individual success of a person is rarely, if not ever, done alone. Behind their victories, there are a team of people that pour into them and facilitate all the greatness you see. David was that to Frederick Douglass and many more. If we take a trip uptown on 140-148 Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and Lexington Avenue in Harlem, you will stumble across AME Zion Church, affectionately called Mother Zion or Freedom Church. The core principles of the Methodist Church was built on unity and brotherly love, but African Americans found themselves still being mistreated and segregated. In a spirit of needing reform inside and outside of the church, the AME Church was developed. Mother Zion is the oldest African American church in New York City, constructed between 1923 and 1925 by one of the first registered African American architects in the USA, with its rapid growth happening out of the need of reform. Freedom Church was an Underground Railroad point of refuge and a very important landmark connected to the abolitionist movement in New York City. Our beloved Frederick Douglass was a member and would grace the pulpit from time to time as a licensed lay preacher. In this very location, Douglass would publish articles for the North Star, a well-known abolitionist newspaper at the time. Members included Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. Your beloved home of New York is rich with African American history that has been forgotten. But the next time you are strolling down the streets of Lower Manhattan or even Harlem, know you are trotting on very important ground.
While today it's occupied by major federal, state, and city administrative buildings, Five Points was a 19th century neighborhood in Lower Manhattan located near what is today known as Columbus Park. The main location was where what is now the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse, and to the south of that is the original Five Points intersection, named for the three streets that intersected there and produced Five Corners. While rich with history, Five Points is also rich in infamy. It was built upon Collect Pond, a body of water that was once an important water source for colonial New York, but had since become unstable and polluted. It was cheaply filled in to create the neighborhood. The area attracted poor families and residents who really couldn't find homes anywhere else in the city. Due to this, Five Points became known as a densely populated, disease-harboring, dangerous slum. On the brighter side, it gave nearly emancipated blacks an affordable community in the city. Along with a developing Italian community, Five Points is credited with being one of America's first true melting pots. However, the people of Five Points didn't always get along, and it is also considered to have had, at the time, one of the highest murder rates of any neighborhood in the world, as black people strived to maintain housing and agency during these times. The struggles of diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, typhus, and more, as well as tragedies like infant and child mortality and desperation due to unemployment plagued the area. While everyone felt these ills, it was especially hard on black people. However, it was in this community, though, that black people were able to help create the art forms that led to tap dancing, as well as jazz and rock and roll. Unfortunately, black people weren't always welcomed with open arms during this time. The anti-abolitionist riots of 1834 proved so. Led by the fear and resentment of black people among a growing Irish population, white Protestants, Irish, and those who identified as anti-black destroyed, looted, and burned property belonging to or culturally significant to black people. One of these areas was the St. Philip's Episcopal Church. That area was led by Minister Samuel Cornish, who was an editor and publisher of the Freedom's Journal, America's first black newspaper. While social reform and muckraking efforts were eventually made and taken seriously, it could not keep 5 Points as the same neighborhood. And in the 20th century, redevelopment began to what we now see today. Another prominent landmark for black people during the 18th and 19th century was the New York African Free School, also known as the African Free School. It was founded by statesman and abolitionist John Jay and his Manumission Society, as well as prominently represented by Broadway's favorite, Alexander Hamilton. While it originally hired white teachers, they eventually employed black teachers, giving students proper representation in their professors. It had one of the earliest forms of charity schooling, as it was supported by donations. The school would grow to large sizes consistently, needed even bigger facilities to house the kids. With its size growth also came success. However, controversial remarks by a prominent professor in the facility eventually led to boycotts, and after a lack of support from the community, its run ended as a private institution as well as a place for learning, as the African Free School would close down in 1835. However, while these institutions and neighborhoods proved to have their struggles during this time, they also proved that black people had a space that they created to flourish and maintain during the early creation of New York City, and prove that black people have a significant history in New York City and in the development of New York City.
One thing we'd like to leave with you is, despite every obstacle, our ancestors were able to nurture families, overcome loss and separation, and to pass along cultural legacies to the next generation. This is why we celebrate. Please subscribe to our website for more information and for updates as we get ready to resume in a post-COVID-19 environment. We are www.newroadtourny.com.